So welcome to the second of our series on Psyche. And today, Steve Ellman in New York is going to be introducing us to instincts and their vicissitudes and giving us some thoughts to chew on. What I'd like to suggest is that while he's speaking, that we just put your screen on speaker view so we see him, and then when he's done we can go back to gallery view, and also that you have yourself muted while he's speaking. Then we have a general discussion, and you can either during the discussion use the hand up signal or just raise your hand. There are not too many of us, so that should be manageable. So thanks very much, Steve, for kicking us off here, and over to you.
Okay, so in a sense, I'm using instincts and the vicissitudes as a beginning point of what I consider Freud's third era. And I divide Freud's career into 4 eras. This one being, from my point of view, the most meaningful. And I think it's particularly important for a comparative group, because I think from this era, a number of concepts have begun that, Klein, Winnicott, Coet, Bion, and others have taken up. And so I'm going to try to specify some of them, or at least allude to some of them. But before I can really get to dynamics of transference and what I call Freud's third era, which involve, I think, something that's poorly named, the metapsychological, some of the papers, the metapsychological papers. I just want to remind us that, up to a certain point, certainly at the beginning of Freud's career with Breuer and Studies on Hysteria, Freud was really talking about the beginning of what I've called a pathogenic memory model. The attempt was to get patients to remember, and he did this in a variety of ways: first hypnosis, then the pressure technique. Then he began to get to a psychotherapeutic technique. And from my point of view, transference was really, he tried to, certainly in Studies in Hysteria, he made transference in the third section an incidental part of the treatment. It's something you can ignore. It occurs, but don't worry about it. It can easily be brushed aside. From my point of view, and I'm going to contest some of the biographers and certainly some of the editors of the standard edition, Gay got it wrong. If you look at Freud's career, he writes 2 papers on psychotherapy in 1903 and 1904. He never mentions transference there. I think he doesn't write the postscript to the Dora case till 1905, when the case actually comes out. And at that point, he does what Brian Bird, who wrote a very good paper on transference, but since it was the only paper he wrote, he's not well known. But he wrote a very good paper on transference, saying that in some ways that was Freud understanding transference in the most intimate detail, when he realizes what he missed with Dora, and he begins to talk about the transference that he thinks occurred in that case. If that's an objection to anything I've said, I apologize, and I'm willing to take it back. But at any rate, but even there, Freud is half-hearted and said, well, maybe if I would have analyzed her homosexuality. Maybe that would have done it. He still really wasn't fully at home with transference. But as he goes along, he begins to leave the dream technique, which he thought would be a royal road to the unconscious. And by 1911, in Dynamics of Transference, he advises people around him and in print that it's really the transference that we have to look at. But still, even in that paper, in the Dynamics of Transference, he is talking about a pathogenic memory model. Transference is a resistance to remembering. And it's not till he really is developing much more of his ideas about fantasy and the idea of an interior mental life that's not simply a group of memories, but constructed early on in development, that he begins to write a paper that imparts, and a long time ago, I wrote a book called Freud's Technique Papers, where I said that Freud sounded almost Winnicottian in his repetition recollection paper, where he really started saying that the transference was the thing in and of itself, which was, a shift from him. So he goes from transference being inconsequential to in the middle of a dream theory where he thinks you can analyze dreams, and exclusively to where he begins to understand transference until, sort of the middle of 1913, 1914, he begins to really see the transference as really a reflection of the person's internal world in a different way than he had understood it before. So I was going to go through more of this, but I'd like to leave time for us to discuss this. And I think most of what I've spoken about is certainly familiar. But here's a question that I used to ask, and it was certainly an annoying question. What were Freud's psychosexual stages in 1913? So I would ask you to just write down your answers. But my guess is that a majority would not at least have the same answer I do, or the same answers that the editors of the Standard Edition do. So I would pause for a second and say, part of the reason we don't have the answer that, say, in the 1913 paper, Freud, in the beginning of the preface to that, the editors of the Standard Edition are going to give you some of what I'm saying, is because most of us didn't read 3 essays the way Laplanche told us to read 3 essays. That is, to read it without the footnotes. And so we had 3 essays as if it was really, Freud's theory in terms of stages, which it wasn't at that point in 1905. So here's my answer to what the stages were in 1913, 1914. Autoerotism, these are the psychosexual stages: autoerotism, narcissism, object choice, and object love. Now, it's entirely possible to me that no one else has those same stages. But if you look at the preface to the 1913 paper that I'm referring to, the editors of the Standard Edition would say his psychosexual stages at that point were autoerotism, narcissism, anal sadism, and object love. So there's only one difference that we have, and I'm going to argue that their name for it, Freud didn't name the stage, was not really the name that one would give to that stage, but I'll present it and you can think about it. So here I'm going to start going over these stages and then talk somewhat about how Freud thought about the instincts at that point in time. So if you remember, Freud had a dual instinct theory for most of the time that I'm now talking about, certainly from 1901 on. And the dual instinct theory till before 1919 were survival of the self is the first instinct, and the sexual instinct is the second instinct. So those were the dual instincts that Freud had at that time. And in Instincts and the Vicissitudes, he will go over the different forms of love in each of the stages. So let's begin with autoerotism. During autoerotism, you're really having, I'll use the term ego libido for the survival of the self instinct, object libido for the sexual instinct. Ego libido is certainly predominates in that at that point. And Freud says something interesting there. During autoerotism, he says there are no libidinal cathexis. Strange idea, except if you read a long quote of his that Winnicott quotes, I don't know, I would say at least, I remember 3 times that Winnicott uses this quote, but others. And Freud says, you know, I couldn't, this is in 2 Principles of Mental Functioning, he said, I couldn't really think about this fantasy of pleasure being the central issue with the external world, really, with the child really being either indifferent to the external world or hating the external world, unless, he says, the employment of a fiction like this is justified where one considers that the infant, provided one includes with it the care it receives from the mother, does almost realize a psychical system of this kind. I was going to read the whole quote. It's one of the longest quotes that Freud had. It goes almost 2 pages, where he tries to describe the idea of a psychical system between infant and mother. Strange, not one we ordinarily associate with Freud, or it's not one that's easily associated with Freud. And what he's trying to get at is that the infant moves from a pleasure ego to a reality ego, but the reality ego is concerned with pleasure. And you can have a fiction like that if you have a mother who really is able to provide almost as the need comes up. And what Freud is saying, in effect, is if there is too strong an object representation, I'll put it in Winnicott's terms, there is a kind of impingement on the infant. The infant should be able to assume, in Winnicott's terms, omnipotently, that its needs are met by a holding mother who is able to present as the infant needs this. So, and the infant, the reality that the infant has in terms of the reality ego is that the infant learns to signal. And when I write about this 3rd section of Freud, and and I have a chapter on Winnicott in the same book, I say, you know, Winnicott's ideas about absolute dependence are very similar to Freud's ideas of autoerotism, except that Winnicott really spells out what the mother has to do to achieve what Freud is talking about in terms of a psychical system like this. And Freud said, again, if the attachment is strong and the object is cathected, there will probably be some kind of fixation. So Winnicott would talk about impingements. Freud would talk about an early fixation. Oh, wow. Did I lose? I'm sorry. I've lost the picture. Got it back. Don't know what happened. Anyway, sorry about that. So Freud is beginning to talk about something that's very similar to Winnicott's ideas of absolute dependence. At the same time, in Two Principles of Mental Functioning, Freud is talking about the idea of receiving sense impressions. And it takes him 3 essays to really formulate. Two Principles of Mental Functioning is the first one, where sense impressions are received, and he talks about how they are then translated into symbolic terms. In Repression and in the Unconscious, written in the same period, he talks about how sense impressions, if powerful enough, become thing representations, and the translation for it to become conscious, a word representation has to be developed. By word representation, it's a bad translation. It should have really been symbolic representation that he's talking about. And Bion is, in learning from experience, is using Freud's ideas in Two Principles of Mental Functioning maybe 4 or 5 times when he goes over and talks about how these things are combined. I'm not going to go over Bion's ideas of going from beta to alpha elements, but it is not, so unlike. So in the next stage, the stage of narcissism, Freud begins with something, the stage of narcissism, which develops over a period of time. The first probably references of it are in section 3 of the Schreber case, in his paper on narcissism. But the reason I go to instincts and the vicissitudes is that Freud here is talking about the purified pleasure ego, which I think the editors of the standard edition mistake for the pleasure ego. But Freud is talking about something completely different. I guess I won't go back to read from it, but essentially what Freud is saying is at some point, the infant developing child is going to feel internal instinctual stimuli as unpleasurable, and not be able to quickly have it dealt with. The age of autoerotism is ended. Those of us who brought up infants know that at some point we help the child end it by saying, I think he or she can sleep through this or deal with it. At this point, we become less present holding parents. And Freud's saying 2 things happen then, which to a large extent he gets from Ferenczi. One is the infant begins to split the world. It's not just that the world is indifferent to him, but the infant begins to split the world and split the ego and split. I think das Ich there means really a sense of self, begins to split its sense of self and project out or evacuate. I'll use slightly the Kleinian idea, its mind from the unpleasurable aspect of what's coming in internally, and introject whatever is pleasurable. So Freud early on is seeing a projective introjective cycle that's similar to the idea of projective identification, where the infant begins to take in objects that it is projected into and now seen as bad, but the aspects of the object that it sees as good, it makes part of the self at the beginning. So the purified pleasure ego purifies the ego in terms of aversive elements. It splits both the ego and the world, at that point. So Freud says, I get emotional even when I talk about it. Freud says that is a new development. And in a sense, the child who dealt with the world in terms of reality signal, it gets the pleasure that it needs, now is seeing the world in a whole different way. And this new way that it's seeing the world at this point is based on the development of the purified pleasure ego, which is the beginning of narcissism. Freud assumes that through development, the child begins to have a unified sense of self and a unified object, but holds on to the idea that he put forth, I think, on page 60, 61 in the Schreber case, where he begins to say that during the end part of the stage of narcissism, it's not that the child thinks that the object is part of itself, but is like itself. And he doesn't just mean like itself physically, he makes that clear. Doesn't have necessarily the same genitals, but has the same desires, the same permissions, et cetera, is like itself in that way. So he develops that idea of narcissism, and he then in an essay that comes before, but it's really part of his thinking, the 1913, The Choice of Neurosis essay, he begins to say, what happens after narcissism, for the infant, or now developing child that's no longer an infant. And here, this is where the editors of the Standard Edition say, he talks about anal sadism. Certainly, during this period of time, the child may very well be concerned with anal issues and issues of the body, urethral anal issues that are going on. But Freud is saying something else that it seems to me is quite important, that the child during this stage, if the stage is going well, makes a choice. And that is that the love of the object is more important than the pleasure that it may get from picking up a vase and throwing it across the room, or running when you're not supposed to, or whatever, or defecating in one's pants, or whatever it might be, that the love of the object is more important. And Freud makes a distinction and says, look, if the child begins to transform its pleasures in terms of caring for the object and wanting love from the object, then things are going well. If the child does it because the parent says, look, if you don't do this, you get punished in one form or another, then Freud is saying that would lead to an anal sadistic outcome. So you can name it one can name it any way you want, but it seems to me the importance of the stage is that if the child goes through it well, the child is making a choice based on love. And now the external world, it's only when the external world is particularly disagreeable that the child hates the external world. But I will go over love and hate in a second. But the child now has the idea of loving something external to it. And the external part is important because the parent no longer has the same wishes as the child. The parent now is saying, look, you have to do things in a different way, not in the way that you wish to or wanted to, but in a different way. So just to stop at those three stages, Freud is now defining all of this in terms of the relationship of the infant developing child to the object. From my perspective, he is distinctly taking an object relations perspective. It's not that he doesn't think instinctual pressures are important. He does. And so the first part of instincts and the vicissitudes is really, from my perspective, a sophisticated view of instinct where he puts forth a hypothesis about cortical development that's quite interesting in terms of why mammals have more cortical development, why mammals would need to be able to inhibit instincts in a much more sophisticated way than birds that might have a fixed action pattern, et cetera, et cetera. We can discuss that more fully because the only birds that are similar to mammals are predator birds. And if you want, I'll give you a REM sleep hypothesis about that in terms of that, because most adult birds have very little REM sleep. The only adult birds that have REM sleep are predator birds, but let me leave that. I shouldn't have introduced that aside, but the more important part of the beginning parts of instincts and vicissitudes is how Freud is talking about the transformation of instincts, which is crucial to mammals, particularly land-living mammals who have to have a whole variety of different kinds of behaviors in their repertoire to survive, eat, have sex, build places that they can inhabit. So the last stage is object love. And object love for Freud happens late, but it's unclear to me that, whether everyone recognizes that Freud's ideas about the Oedipal period occurring in childhood didn't happen till late in his career. I mean, relatively late. But from his point of view, object love develops as a result of the Oedipus complex. So I'm not going to go through the Oedipus complex in detail, since I think most of us have an idea of Freud's idea about the Oedipus complex. For me, the important part of the Oedipus complex, which frequently is lost, is Freud's idea that the end of the Oedipus complex is the capacity for object love. And object love is different than object choice. Object love is the ability, from Freud's perspective, to love another who may have other loves. It's to love another who also has another. And that can occur with any kinds of parents or single parent who loves something else besides the child or has other activities, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, that's the crucial part of the end of the Oedipus. So, that the capacity for object love is developed. If you look at Anna Freud's ideas about the superego, it seems to me she's someone who clearly understood, unfortunately, many others around her didn't, that Freud's idea of the superego developing at this point in time, and undoubtedly precursors of the superego are developing before that, before the stage of object love. But she says, look, insofar as the superego develops well, it is indistinguishable from the ego. It becomes part of it. It becomes a series of values that have to do with caring, love, and the desire for love of a certain kind of work. So I've gone a little longer than I wanted, but so from Freud's perspective, each of these stages has an element of fantasy attached to it. And each of these stages, and obviously there is a regression back and forth, or can be a regression back and forth between the stages, but each of these stages, have a certain kind of love. So in the first stage, as I've already said, what the child loves is pleasure. And the child is somewhat indifferent to the external world. Now, the editors of the standard edition say Freud sometimes says the child hates the external world, first or indifferent. My reading of it is that Freud is implying if the external world impinges too strongly on the child, then the child hates it. If not, the child is indifferent to it and is in a state that I think Winnicott correctly describes as a certain kind of omnipotence that's present. So that's in the pages, I don't know, 136, 137, something like that, where the editors say, Freud first said hate, and then he says indifferent. My interpretation is he says he means indifference if things go well. He means hate if the environment impinges too strongly on it. But certainly in the second stage of narcissism, the child hates the external world that is not part of itself, and loves those things that are either inside of itself or gradually like itself as the child goes through narcissistic development or development during this narcissistic stage. So that love and hate are present, but they have to do with the extent to which this part of the ego. So there are only two people who really pick up the purified pleasure ego. One of them, I won't go through both of them because then I'd be bound to make a slight detour that would take 5 or 10 minutes. But one of them is Kohut, who was a very good reader of Freud and makes, I think, a very good reader of Freud. and certainly alerts people to the idea of the purified pleasure ego and the importance of the purified pleasure ego, at that point in time. In terms of object choice, love and hate start to change. The child starts to be transformed in terms of love and hate, in terms of what's permitted and what isn't permitted, and the whole idea of trying to transform its activities in terms of the mother's or the main parents. It doesn't necessarily have to be a woman, but the main parents' guide and the main parents' aid in transforming various kinds of behaviors from more instinctual behaviors into more socially adaptive behavior. But even there, Freud is talking about the whole idea of narcissism still being present, because even though there is an acceptance of another having different views and wanting different activities, there still is a kind of narcissistic tie to the parent, going on, which starts to shift when the child is able to internalize values in the stage of object love that become the child's own values, that are internalized and to some extent, gradually depersonified and separate from the parents' values. So something that I wanted to say, in the United States, for a while, the classical position made Brenner, Arlo, I assume analysts that are at least fairly well known to you, or at least I'm not sure how well Arlo and Brenner translated into England and the continent, but certainly the Oedipal period was the centerpiece. And it's something that occurred with Freud after 1919 and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and Ego and the Id, et cetera, et cetera. Although the problem of anxiety really shifted back to the earlier model implicitly, but people didn't quite pick that up in the 1926 paper. So one of the things that's interesting that I thought I did think I would read this to you. This is from paper on narcissism. He says, psychoanalytic research has from the very beginning recognized the existence and importance of the masculine protest. Just before that, since I know I didn't read his shot at Jung, I think I'll leave that out. But I haven't heard anybody, no Adlerian in the group, so I thought I'd read this. The importance of the masculine protest, but it has regarded it in opposition to Adler as narcissistic in nature and derived from the castration complex. The masculine protest is concerned in the formation of character, and he goes on. I find it quite impossible to place the genesis of neurosis upon the narrow basis of the castration complex, however powerfully it may come to the fore in men among their resistances to the cure of a neurosis. Incidentally, I know of cases of neurosis in which the masculine protest, or as we regard it, the castration complex, plays no pathogenic part and even fails to appear at all. Interesting. He's saying in the paper on narcissism that you don't see the castration complex in various neuroses. And certainly you can't place the basis of neurosis on this narrow ledge. Interestingly, in a letter dated September 30th, 1926, Eduardo Weiss, an interesting analyst, wrote to Freud about what he meant here. Freud wrote back, "Your question in connection with my assertion in my paper on narcissism as to whether there are neuroses in which the castration complex plays no part puts me in an embarrassing position. I no longer recollect what it was I had in mind. Today, it is true I could not name any neurosis in which this complex is not met with. In any case, I should not have written the sentence today. But we know so little of the whole subject that I should prefer not to give a final decision either way." Others maybe should have had some of that reluctance. From my perspective, Freud's putting the Oedipal period in such a central place after 1919 had to do with Ronk and Jones's egging him on to make a statement in opposition to birth anxiety. But in addition, Freud, after the war, did very little clinical work. So the period that I'm talking about now, the third period, where he writes, instincts and the vicissitudes, narcissism, repression, and the unconscious, and a variety of other papers. During that period, he is actively engaged clinically. After the war, he really isn't. And if anything, he regresses in terms of some of his clinical ideas about this, in terms of analyzing your own dreams and a variety of other things. And it's not till the construction paper in 1937 when he really starts to think, in my opinion, starts to think again clinically. So I thought I would at least read you something that showed that for Freud, during this period, the Oedipal phenomena were not nearly as central as it was afterwards. And in point of fact, there was only one disorder that he thought had a fixation point in the Oedipal period. And that was hysteria in terms of neurotic hysteria, hysteria at a neurotic level. Everything else had a fixation point before that: the obsessional neuroses, narcissism, schizophrenia, etc. And so the movement of everything being filtered through and fixated, the point of fixation occurring in the Oedipal period, was Freud's after the war, and then got solidified, unfortunately, in the classical position in the United States. But it was never either Anna Freud's or Hartman's position, but others in the United States, which I won't go through. Anyway, I think I will end here with, I guess, just one sentence. During this period, Freud starts to really think about fantasy in a different way than he had before in the pathogenic memory model, and starts to think about an internal world that's created that at times has nothing to do with reality, but is a way that the child develops conflicts, et cetera, and starts to develop an internal world that he feels, when he is really dealing with things clinically,
Okay, that's really great, Steve. Thanks for leading us through so many interesting elements there.
Okay.
So I'd like to open discussion. So if you want to just, put yourself forward, or raise your hand physically, or raise your hand in the Zoom way. we can begin to see what you made of the paper and of some of Steve's suggestions. Barbara, yeah? Can you
Well, yes. Could we have this last sentence that Stephen was saying? He was in the middle of a sentence, and I was very interested in what Steve was saying at this very end. Could you continue that sentence, Steve, so that we could follow it?
I'm not sure, but let's see if I can. Some probability. What I was really trying to say is that during this period, Freud begins to really think about fantasy in a different way, and the child's development of an internal world of conflict as apart from his previous view of the pathogenic memory model, which was more a trauma model, but solely, not that they can't be traumas, but solely a trauma model, but it now is a creation of the child in terms of the environment, instincts, the object, and the sensitivities of the child. And the last part of that was, and from his point of view, the only way to really see it clearly in a treatment is to allow the conditions of transference to manifest itself. So he finally actually begins to believe in transference for a very brief period of time in the manifestations of transference.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Serves you right for cutting me off, David.
Steve, I really appreciated how you emphasize the notion that Freud introduces a dual theory of drives very early in his career, even though it's not stated that way until later. But the other point that you made that's not often talked about at least in Freudian circles, is that Freud really introduces 3 dimensions of psychoanalytic history, having to do with the centrality of the drives, the ego, and object relations, as early as this paper.
And active passive as part of it. That's just part of the 3. Yes.
Yeah. One aspect of that paper, of the vicissitudes paper, that for me is really important, is that he isolates these 4 dimensions of the drive, and with some precision that I think is helpful, because on one hand, we can't help but the fact that we're a body, and anyone who wants to deny the centrality of our embodiment is living in some kind of delusional land, like, everything is relational these days, Well, that's a developmental achievement, and it's prepared by what Freud's talking about. The notion, before you relate to anything, yourself or others, you have to have this internal, engine, so to speak, these pulsions, these desires, these impulses that have to be corralled and organized in some level. And of course, we not only do we have these embodied desires, but I like the term pulsional desire. Vergota introduced that to me. But how could you conceive of psyche without the drives, without the drives having a certain intentionality, a direction, a telos, an aim. And of course, we have a multitude of objects to choose from to gain satisfaction or gratification, but also everything else under the sun. So in many ways, that's what I take away from that paper, is a precision of how psychic economy in many ways works. The one thing that I'm critical of in Freud is that he seems to make the drives the center of agency when he speaks this way, and that doesn't make any sense to me, because I think a drive isn't just an agency. It has to be developed within the ego. So I'm wondering if you have any comments or thoughts about that.
I have two comments. One is, I think the implications of what let me start with one thing. I didn't go over the first half of the paper because it seemed to me that was the more familiar part. And I didn't want to go over the more familiar part. But let me just pick that up. Part of Freud's genius is how understanding how the child, infant, developing child, started to see the world through bodily processes, and through bodily processes that are to some extent fueled by the drives. But one of the things that I wanted to go over is the implications of this era of theorizing, is that Freud logically would have to say, sometimes, and it's something that I've said, but I think logically Freud would have to say that sometimes the drives are central in a child's development. There are some children that are so bound to, they are at one end of the bell-shaped curve, high drive children, high instinct children, high endogenous, what I call high endogenous stimulation children, endogenous internal stimulation children. But for most, the drives are one factor. It's Freud, I think, based on what I've presented today and the papers that he's put together during this period of time, it's a multiple factor model, and it depends on the child which factor is crucial. So that for some children, drives probably are central. For some children, you might have to ignite aspects of endogenous stimulation in the children. The mother, for some children, you might necessarily have to be a container for the high. For some, you might have to be a facilitator. And for most, most of the population is in between, depending on what. So I would thank you for bringing up the more central thing that people know about Freud, about the embodied aspect of development. And I think his brilliance in bringing that, that how children see the world in terms of bodily functions. But I would say the logic of his theory is that it's a multiple factor model, and the drives may not be the most significant factor for many children. Don't tell anybody from New York Psychoanalytic that I said that.
I guess they wouldn't be considered to be very driven.
I mean, I think one of Freud's ideas is that one could be driven and obsessed for a variety of reasons. We talked about obsession. Let me ask a question. How many of you would have answered Freud's psychosexual stages being autoerotism, narcissism, object choice or anal sadism, and object love at 1914? I wonder about that. All right, I'm not getting an overwhelming response.
No, I think you're right that most people, if they're not familiar with the early essays on sexuality paper, that you would just do a classical textbook introductory thinking of the main stages of psychosexual development that you read as a freshman in college.
I think that's right. Which leaves out Freud's whole time of trying to develop the idea of relation to the object and relation to the object in terms of different kinds of love and hate.
Speaking of Jung, one thing that I do not think Jung is correct on, and that's he keeps reiterating in his writings about how Freud only talked about libido, and I'm sure some of the Jungians here might correct me on that, but it seems to be too one-dimensional of a criticism, because really for Freud, even though you might call it Lust, that it did have a certain psychic energy too. The drives have a certain psychic energy, and they're directed in different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean it's all sexual. And then, of course, by the end of his career, he expands this libidinal theory into a general theory of eros, and that is a much more metaphorically a return to the Greek notion of desire, and we know that desire has basically endless or boundless applications. So I'm wondering I'm just wondering if it might be the case that when Jung is reading Freud and Freud's reading Jung, and they both are taking pot shots at one another, like he did in that paper that you were reading about Adler, that this kind of perpetuates an antagonism, unnecessarily so, where people aren't reading other people's work and engaging in that kind of comparative thinking.
Well, I don't know how to respond to that, but I mean, obviously the how they read each other and responded to each other after the split is kind of very polemical and political. But one thing that really grabbed my attention reading this was, I mean, in the preface, the editor's preface, they quote from the unconscious, the paper, The Unconscious. An instinct can never become an object of consciousness. Only the idea that represents the instinct can. Even in the unconscious, moreover, an instinct cannot be represented otherwise than by an idea. So this had huge resonances with, Jung's, the difference between an archetype and an archetypal image, that the archetype is unknowable. And in this passage anyway, Freud is saying the instinct is unknowable. And so I find that really fascinating in analytical psychology, that how to think about this gap between the archetype and archetypal image. And in a way, that gap is here between the instinct and the idea. You know, what's going on there? How do you
well, Freud thought about the unconscious in three different ways. It's not all in that preface, but it is in the next two papers on the unconscious and repression. That's why I briefly mentioned thing representation and word representation.
mm-hmm.
That from Freud's point of view, sense impressions coming externally, internally or externally, they can be sense impressions that won't be conscious, won't stay conscious. They will only be conscious if they're combined with word representations, what he called word. Really, in a different German translation, you could say symbolic representations. And it's only when the word and thing representation combine can you feel both the affect and the idea together. You know, but Freud also had the idea that there was a good deal of instinct that was never transformed into either thing. It's unformulated. Now a number of people are making a large part of it, that it's unformulated and has never been translated either into thing or word representation. And the way I've translated it is in terms of Cassira's idea of either denotative or connotative meanings, that it's only when thing and word representation are together that there's connotative meaning that can be linked to other symbols. I try to then incorporate that into some of Bion's ideas. And I think that's what Freud had in mind, but he thought that a good deal of instinct would never be translated. The archetype would never achieve consciousness, even symbolically.
Mm.
This is, in my view, the Kantian, mode of thinking of both, Freud and Jung.
Thing in itself.
Yeah, that's right. You always have a boundary, and to tie it in with David's comment about the archetype. I mean, Jung was writing around this time on the archetype, and he first gives a great deal of credit to the archetype as being instinctual, and we know how. We know just how convoluted the concept of archetype is, given that it's being debated to this day by the Jungians and post-Jungians.
Well, instinct is certainly being debated by post-Freudians. I have a particular view of instinct that I think derives from Freud, but does not fit in with Eros and Thanatos, but is more Darwinian than that. That really has to do with survival issues. But I'm not surprised that there are Jungian debates about archetypes.
Barbara, I think your hand's up.
Barbara's hand is up.
That's correct. Would the instinct be formulated by the myth?
Would the instinct be formulated by the myth? I'm not. Could
Because
you
You were talking about just a second ago about how the instinct is never or put into words or made conscious. But don't we have that the instinct is formulated by the myth? So, for example, do we have in the Oedipus myth a formulation of instinct?
I think in the Oedipus myth, we have a formulation of instinctual derivatives,
Okay.
is the way
Okay. Okay.
I would put it. But that was Freud's ideas. I think endogenous stimulation is experienced as intensity, as you know, whether someone can consciously formulate what they are experiencing is another question. But I think there is some sensory experience of that. But I was only talking about Freud's ideas, but my idea would be quite different than that. That is a high endogenous stimulation child experience a kind of pressure that's going on a lot of the time in its body. They may be able to formulate it only in terms of a myth or an idea, but it's a different question. I mean, the reason I chose this is to try to get a different slant on Freud than, and I should have said concentrate more on the second half of the essay than the instincts and the vicissitudes.
Well, he packs a lot into this, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. But I think you can only fully get it if you know where he's said these things in other places. And sometimes, you know, you are misled by, you know, when the editors of the standard edition say the reality ego and the pleasure ego had already been introduced in the paper, Two Principles of Mental Functioning. That's not what he's talking about when he talks about the purified pleasure ego. It's a whole different thing. And I had a long discussion with Alan Tyson, one of the translators, who said that was true. He agreed, but he said, try translating all of Freud's work. You'll get some differences. So I think that was misleading. They didn't understand. He wasn't talking about the pleasure ego there, but the purified pleasure ego. Somebody has their hand up.
Yeah, Jeremy?
I was interested in this comparison with Jung, you know, where Jung says you can't address the archetype directly, any images of the archetype. And in this paper on instinct, is this, I mean, on the first page of the paper, which is 117 in the standard edition, are you thinking, David, where Freud says, even at the stage of description, it is not possible to avoid applying certain abstract ideas to the material? Would that be a kind of archetypal idea that Freud is applying? And later he's saying, I'm not quite sure, he says, about 10 lines down, they must at first necessarily possess some degree of indefiniteness. I guess he's still talking about his ideas. his archetypal ideas. And it's interesting that he's saying it can be difficult to separate the archetype from the phenomena, making repeated references to the material of observation from which they appear to have been derived, but upon which, in fact, they have been imposed. So it's almost like there's a difficulty in distinguishing between, you know, the phenomena and the archetypal thinking.
But I think Freud would object if you translated him as being talking about archetypes. But I guess it's not that, I'm not saying these are exactly the same, but it's a similar problem, the problem of how do you represent what's unknowable, or how do you represent what's unrepresentable? And I think, you know, what Freud says there about, to some degree, you kind of make it up as you go along, and you throw things at it and you see what sticks. So I'm sure that Freud and Jung thought about this in different ways, but it seems to me it's a similar problem of how to, you know.
Freud at this point in time is thinking about theory. This is the third paper in which he mentions some aspect of theory. And he at first says, my theory comes from clinical observation. It's derived from clinical observation. He then, 1915, before he writes this paper, says, you know, a lot of the way we observe comes from our basic theory, and our theories really affect the way we observe and what we're observing, and we have to really be careful because our observations are tilted by our preconceived theories. And I think here he is going over that idea and saying, you know, I'm going to put forth some ideas for parts of instinct and how it's developed, but it's abstract, and I think it's explanatory, but that really is the question: how explanatory is the concept? I would say even further, and it's part of the reason that I have been looking for neurophysiological correlates of things that I would call, if you can't eventually make a theory that has a predictive aspect, you don't really have a theory. So even if you say there's an unformulated part of the instinct, you have to say, well, why is that important? And what does that mean? In some children, is there a way of determining whether part of the instinct is more unformulated than in other children? And what are the implications of that? That's, I think, where the theory should take you and see whether or not you can. But that goes back to a question that I was asking before. What are our criteria for a good theory? What are our epistemological assumptions about theory construction? You know, do we have the same, if we're going to have comparative theories, do we have the same assumptions about our epistemology? I don't know the answer to that, but I think at least we should know that, whether we do or not.
That's a difficult task.
Yes, I didn't answer you when you asked.
Hi, Steve. I just want to ask you a question. How to express it. How do you think Freud would draw a line between his thinking and object relation, like Klein and Bion? What would he say? Do you think to to distinguish? What would he say? What would he agree with? And I know it's probably too difficult. It's a big question, but what do you think?
No,
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a question that I implicitly ask all the time. And I wrote a book where I included Freud, Klein, beyond. I think Freud, from my point of view, one of the things that Klein observed, and Edith Jacobson observed them as well. I was going to talk about that today, but I decided that would take us too far afield, as early triangulations. And there was so much political pressure on her in terms of describing the early triangulations that she called them Oedipal. But Edith Jacobson writes about early triangulations. None of them are Oedipal. And I don't think the ones that Klein describes are Oedipal either. Although I think her notion about positions is a very good one. And I think Freud would like it. For instance, if you look at Abraham's work, Abraham really had some of the implicit ideas that Klein is coming up with in terms of positions, and Abraham saw much more clearly the clinical implications of psychosexual stages. So it wasn't just sex, but a whole way of thinking about that. So I think, and Freud had difficulty with some of Abraham's thoughts, but mostly he liked them. So I think if Freud would have stayed healthy, and I think Freud would have liked that. Beyond then goes the non-mystical parts of beyond, I think are, here's what Spelius, I assume you're in England, you know Spelius, who was a friend of mine. Spelius, in one of her books, writes, Bion was trying in a variety of ways, I'll just pick one way, to translate Freud. So evenly suspended attention, a Freudian idea. Spelius says Bion translated that into be without memory and desire. That the only way to have evenly suspended attention, because if you look at Freud's writings on evenly suspended attention, he is saying one of the things we don't want to do is apply our theory to what we're observing in a way. And Bion takes that a step further. Now, can we be without memory and desire? No, but we can start to look at how our memory and desire affects us. And that's the way I take Bion's plaint that, we have to realize the extent to which memory and desire pushes us and takes us away from the present moment. And I think Freud was striving to get at the present moment as well, in the construction paper even more strongly. So I think he'd like parts of Bion. He wouldn't like the mystical parts, although Freud had his mystical parts as well. I don't know if that's an answer, but it's an attempt.
Okay, thanks.
But doesn't Freud always start with an idea? He may say the true beginning of scientific activity consists in describing phenomena, but hasn't he always got an idea first?
I think all of us do. I think we can't make an observation without an idea. So that I don't think Freud is peculiar in that. Yet, if you look at how Freud shifted, he makes remarkable shifts from my point of view. He doesn't end, I would have liked him to live another 30, 40 years and see if he could have, but he makes remarkable shifts. Just the whole leaving of the pathogenic memory model was quite a thing. To leave that, and to really recognize transference, whatever your view of transference is, at least an expression of an internal world that's different than memory, than merely memory, but it's constructed. That's quite a shift that he makes in 15 years, having a whole different point of view. And he leaves his dream theory, even though it's probably the most elaborated theory in psychoanalysis. He leaves that and says, no, you can't really base a treatment on analyzing dreams. That's that shows a certain kind of, I certainly don't leave ideas that easily. I run one more experiment or see one more patient to try to prove it.
So with transference, you're kind of left with the ideas that people have in the first place. Which are, if you like, helping them interpret the world, or these are the ideas we have before we, which we use to on the phenomena, to shape the phenomena of the world.
To some extent, to a large extent, yeah. That's true. I think Hartman was correct in saying there are some parts of the psychological apparatus that are relatively unaffected by transference, small parts. But most of us are affected by transference relatively continuously. It's the extent to which we're affected that's really the question. Obviously, not everybody will agree with that statement, but
it reminds me of a time when I met an analyst who was a Bionian, and this was at like the Christmas party for the Institute, and we were meeting for the first time, and he says, there's no such thing as reality. Everything's transference, except for when you exchange money. And I said, you must be out of your mind. This is how we began our conversation. But in many ways, if you go on the premise that we engage the world through our fantasies at all times, then that would be true. Everything is transference, but it's not just transference.
everything is affected by transference, but it's certainly not just transference. But you can see around the world how cult-like figures are cropping up. Group psychology was one of, it's not read any longer, one of Freud's better papers, where he really describes, I think it's a good description of cult-like, phenomena. And, there you're talking about, I think, a kind of narrow transference to a figure that will help the person survive and hold the person in a primitive way. It's quite frightening. So we need to do more analysis of transference, make it less central. Not easy to do. But only money is the reality. Okay. That's must have been a New York Bionian.
No, I actually think he was from Argentina, so he didn't have much.
Okay, all right.
Well, Steve, thanks very much. Any final thoughts for us?
No, thank you for enduring my view of Freud's object relations aspects. And I hope that gets included as part of our comparative ideas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very, very stimulating.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Very interesting.
Thanks.
Well,
Thanks so much, Steve.
you're very welcome. I guess I'll see you next Wednesday.
I hope so. Yeah. Okay. Bye for now, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.